name is Mark McPherson, and I'm the director of the Daedalus Investigative Agency. And I've been asked to come out to the Bloomfield Township Public Library to give a talk on ghosts. It's this time of the year, it's autumn now, and the shadows are lengthening, and it seems a perfect time to consider this part of the mysterious world. Well, I've been asked out here because, in point of fact, I've made the strange, the unusual, the mysterious my business. My investigative agency has taken me all over the world looking at many enigmas, many problems which have fascinated individuals for centuries. We've looked at everything from the possible historic reality of King Arthur and his Camelot, digging up parts of southwest Britain looking for the military hill fortress we believe King Arthur, or at least a man named Arthur, occupied. We've dived on the stone fragments of what may be Atlantis. We have, I'd say probably looked at a number of problems in Egypt, such as who really built the pyramids, the Sphinx. We've considered a variety of problems that are historic, very natural, some of them biological. 9 expeditions in Scotland looking for Nessie, the ubiquitous Loch Ness Monster. After all this time, there are still many questions, and we hope we have a few more answers. At least my goal has been to bring to a number of audiences these problems in a nutshell. That's to say, an evening considering what there is to consider. The facts, the fictions, the folklore about such things as monsters, castles, great mysteries of the world. Tonight, however, we're considering what may be the most significant issue of all, and that is the notion of what used to be called survival. Is there life after death? Are there such things as ghosts? Well, out here in Bloomfield, some people feel that there must have been. As a matter of fact, one of the things we're going to consider this evening is a book written in 1963 by the late Henry Scripps Booth, known as Thistle to his friends. He wrote a story about an alleged ghost at Christ Church, Cranbrook. Real? Fantasy? This is for us to perhaps discover, both through our reading, through our thinking, through our maintaining an open mind. This is what we hope to maintain in all of our travels and all of our adventures. This is what I try to do with Daedalus. I've been called many things. Some of them sort of make me blanch a bit. A real-life ghostbuster, don't much like that. I don't think you can bust a ghost. I think you can bust a ghost story. Michigan's Indiana Jones, I suppose that's flattering. I guess I'd prefer the man from Daedalus, because Daedalus is where I come from. Daedalus is the Greek version of the name of Daedalus, the maze maker, the man who built the ancient Cretan labyrinth, which is also, by the way, the logo for my agency. The circular, concentric sort of logo which indicates the beginning as the end and the end as the beginning. We think it's a questing symbol, a questing initiatory symbol, and it's taken us on the road for some pretty incredible adventures. I hope you'll join us now when we're about to talk about ghosts, both in Cranbrook, in Scotland, around the world, and could they be real? Come on along. The great lexicographer, raconteur, Dr. Samuel Johnson in the 18th century said, talking of ghosts, it is wonderful that 6,000 years have now elapsed since the creation of the world, and still it is undecided whether or not there has ever been an instant of the spirit of any person appearing after death. All argument is against it, but all belief is for it. Now, what are we talking about when we consider the notion of ghosts? Are we talking about what you will see here before you, the sort of spring-made sheet variety of specter? Things that go bump in the night, or perhaps the day? It is interesting that people used to see ghosts looking more like this, and I should think over the last century people have a tendency to see ghosts, at least if it's Uncle Harold on the staircase and he's been a long-distance call for 12 years, he's dressed much as we remember Uncle Harold being dressed. Some people have said, why are they wearing clothes at all? Well, maybe there's a dress code in heaven. We don't know for certain. However, we're talking about, in general, the category of ghosts. And it's an odd taxonomy because obviously there must be many different types. If you read the ghost lore, if you follow the minutes of the Society of Psychical Research, if you have a much haunted house yourself, and I'm led to believe that some of you in fact do. As a matter of fact, the person sitting next to you at this moment may very well be haunted. Take a good look at the person sitting next to you. However, it's not that easy just to say ghost. You know, the original Saxon derivation of the word ghost is gast, which is similar to the word guest. Well, it is interesting to point out that quite often people living in old houses who claim to have a ghost, they think of them as intruders or interlopers. The question is, who's the guest? I live in a house that's over 140 years of age. At one time it was a boarding house, and I'm constantly aware of sounds, shuffling, footsteps, especially when I'm alone in the house. My dogs consistently look up. You know that thing that dogs or cats do? They look up at an empty doorway, and then the thing that bothers you is not just when they look up, but when they follow something that can't be seen. It's an ironic thing. It's a bit of an old paradox to be paying the mortgage and still feel as if you're a guest in the hotel. And yet it happens. Going back to that slide that we started on, you know, the notion of ghosts is really quite an eldritch, ancient thing. There are some lines that have been translated. The man whose spirit hath none to care for it, thou and I have often seen such a case. This is not a Puritan talking. This is somebody writing in the Epic of Gilgamesh, 2000 BC. It is an ancient premise, this notion of a belief that we die and the spirit passes, and dependent upon the care and the ritual, the prayers, the masses, if you will, the precautions taken, that one may, as in the case of the Egyptians, be able to make their passage into the land of the dead. Certainly not all Egyptians were pharaohs, or not all persons who die are royalty. Perhaps it leads us to believe that if there is a hereafter, perhaps, as is pointed out in the Christian theology, you know, the high will be low and the low will be high. Not exactly in those words, but it is the idea that seemingly since the beginning of time, pre-recorded history, pre-biblical accounts, we have believed in the idea of some form of a life force, a soul force, if you will, which makes that transition on. It's comforting, perhaps, to think that as Peggy Lee said, is that all there is? That perhaps there is, in fact, more. And we try to learn about this. We learn about it especially in literature. The shelves in this library are stocked with some very interesting volumes, some of them entertaining, some of them romance, fiction. Ghost lore itself is an interesting branch of fiction. It's not as large a branch as the entire tree, if you will, but it's been a very fertile branch for the longest time. Now, the notion of resurrection, not just in the Christian faith, but we will use this as an example, the idea that the soul, the spirit, does continue. One goes on to their just reward, perhaps along the notion of the spiritualist belief, life is a preparation, and that you go on to a hereafter, which is many levels. And it's not just the Christian philosophy that believes that as you reap you will sow elsewhere. It is the idea that perhaps on another spiritual plane you will benefit from having been more spiritually aware. You will hear Socrates say that as well as Shirley MacLaine. I think it may be a lasting truth. However, the notion of the day when in fact the spirit will continue, or the graves will open and there will be a judgment of sorts. You know, the Egyptians considered that judgment of the soul as very, very important. They knew something even earlier on than, say, the Christian fathers seem to. And yet around the world, particularly for the last century and more, people have gathered to communicate to commune with discarnate entities, dead people. You may have seen that perfectly awful and wonderful, because it's so awful, classic Night of the Living Dead, where I believe it's one of the lawmen comments on the corpse. He says, "He was dead, he was all messed up." Well, the notion is, what is dead? We don't actually know entirely. A doctor will tell you that, clinically dead is a cessation of brain activity perhaps, or is dead when the heart simply ceases to beat, or is dead simply really when the soul leaves the body. It has been said that there is a micromillimeter worth of difference between the weight of a corpse when it has been alive and when it has been dead. Now, forensic people will tell you, well, that could account for a number of reasons. Some people believe that it might be the difference of the soul leaving the body. There was a man named Kidd, a miner, who in about 1946 left a will and left his considerable fortune if, in fact, they could prove there was a soul. We haven't the time tonight to even talk about how long that trial took, interestingly enough, in Phoenix, Arizona, to consider the notion of a soul rising from a dead body. And the question was, anybody who could prove there was a soul would get Kidd's money. Can you imagine the claimants who came out for that? People who claimed to have been Kidd, who had never married, claimed to have been his wife, his children, his friends, Kidd himself, people who had been in spirit communication with him. Well, the gist of it was ultimately that money was split down the middle and given to a neurological scientific institute and a psychical research organization. It's a very difficult thing to consider who should be able to probe the unknown. It's sort of like some of you, if you hear things thumping and bumping in your houses, and you ask that classic question, who are you going to call? Think about it as an exercise. Go to your yellow pages tonight and see what there is under, what? Ghosts? Something nasty in the woodshed? People have a tendency to want to get hold of their ministers, clergy, or they may wind up going to a university or someplace where they hope to find the equivalent of Bill Murray and Dan Aykroyd. People who have perhaps dedicated part of their life to accumulating data about the unusual, to see if we can predict this. In this realm, psychical research, parapsychology has continued. Some of us have spent considerable time gathering that data and considering what it might be and what it might not be. Well, let's take a look at some of the notions, at least one here, of what could be ghosts in the landscape. People, you visit Scotland particularly, that they talk about the corpse lights. The idea traditionally that the spirits of recently deceased individuals would hover near the graves, or they would flit around the countrysides. They might be seen as ghosts. Of course, there's a very rich tradition, which may be unrelated in Scotland and Ireland, to the banshee, that harbinger of death. But in the case of simply seeing phantom ghosts, it could be anything from ball lightning to, as the UFO explanation years ago here in Dexter, Michigan, swamp gas, marsh gas. Many things in nature that don't seem readily apparent are given cosmic supernatural explanations. I could tell you, it would be another program to talk to you about the number of logs I've followed with binoculars down Loch Ness, hoping that log would simply raise up a long serpentine head. I never had a monstrous log do that. However, seeing is not believing, but not seeing, if you forgive the negatives, is not disbelieving, especially when ghosts are coming in, because we expect to see certain things of ghosts, don't we? The notion of the antique idea of ghosts, there's a big question. Many people say, I shouldn't be interested in ghosts, it goes against the Bible. Well, the Bible, the Old and New Testament, are loaded with similar type notions. Obviously, you've got the notion of a spirit which continues beyond what we consider this mortal coil. We find in the Old Testament the story of the witch of Endor summoning up the spirit of Samuel, which was in fact a bit of necromancy, and doing this for Solomon. However, the idea was that if you're going to place that kind of call, you better be able to pay for it. It has always been considered a difficult thing to be in touch with the dead. It is a taboo. However, there is a reference, even in Old Testament times, for the idea that there may be a spirit which continued. In the New Testament, in terms of the resurrection experience, when the followers of Jesus see their risen Lord, he says to them, in effect, I'm not a ghost. You know, a ghost or a spirit, you know, hath not flesh and blood or bone, as you see here. Interesting. Ancient accounts, or even accounts, say, 2,000 years ago, with references for a belief in ghosts, evidence the fact that in that society, they knew of them. They believed in them, many of them. There have been so many different types of ghostly visitations. There have been the kind of visitations where ghosts have returned. They wanted to say goodbye a final time. There have been ghosts who have wanted to warn. There have been ghosts who have showed up, I suppose, just for the heck of it. Just because they didn't know what else to do. There is a theory that sometimes people might make that crossing over from life into death, and many ghosts seemingly have been unaware they're really ghosts. You've seen the film Beetlejuice. The couple who die and they find themselves in their own house not thinking anything is amiss. Just no one told them that they were, as Oprah would say, dead. All right? These people are gone, but they're still here. Now, how do we account for being here instead of after? It's an interesting premise. You know, I often think about this. We hear people talking about the hereafter. I think if we spend more time here studying this type of phenomena and trying to be less afraid of it, we might be in better shape to understand the after. Many different types of ghosts. Some of these spectral apparitions that have occurred have often been over battlefields. It is interesting, at times of great crisis, national calamity, at a time when there is a need for salvation, ghosts seemingly appear. There have been ghosts seen at battlefields after the battle's been over, such as depicted here. Very famous 17th century Battle of Edge Hill in 1642 in Britain. Not only after the battle had been over did they see it replayed in the skies. This has happened several times, accounts. And not just isolated accounts, literally thousands of individuals seeing this thing played out in the skies. Now, was this a ghost? Ghostly situation? Was it some sort of a temperature inversion and people saw something reflected in the sky? There is a phenomenon that climbers often find, thinking that they see a huge shadow of a ghost, whereas in fact they're seeing their own shadows sort of magnified with the lighting, the odd lighting, or what they call the fog bow. For a long time they referred to this phenomena as the giant, especially at a peak in Germany, Brocken. The giant of Brocken turned out to be the climber's own shadow. But reliable witnesses, people not only who had participated in some of these battles, seeing some of their own comrades in these ghostly scenes in the sky. They are documented. You can find them if you care to look for them, or I can refer you to them. This is not me making it up. It is a matter of record. The interesting thing is, you see, what science says is that it's not possible. Now, if you leave the library tonight and you see a lady in a white sheet hovering 4 feet above the ground in the parking lot, if you, madam, see this, they're going to say you're crazy. If the rest of the front row sees it with you, the odds are the authorities will say you had a mass or collective hallucination. If this entire room sees that woman hovering out there, science has been wont to say it is what you would call a psychic pool of energy. They had just heard this lunatic talking about ghosts. They had it in their minds, and they went out and they projected the image of what they may have expected to have seen. And if we interviewed every one of those poor, deluded souls, we'd find that what they claimed to have seen was very much like one of the slides that McPherson had shown them. Now, that doesn't say very much for your experience, does it? It's an odd bind that people who have psychic experiences often find. Who's going to believe me? Number one, the person who's going to believe you about what you saw in your basement last week may have had to have seen one in her basement too. Now, I'm not trying to make light of this, although it's important to keep it on an even keel, but there are many of you here tonight, I know, not because I'm psychic. Psychic is something else. I know because you come to these talks that I give from time to time because you want, not assurance, but you're helped by the fact not only do you know this has happened before and it happens again and again, but there's somebody else very close by who's had a similar experience. It's kind of a sharing thing. There have been many objects as well as individuals seen in ghostly form. There are certain rare cases of ghostly aircraft that have been seen in the skies that have been sort of out of time. There are classical types of ghosts said to inhabit churchyards, which is interesting because it's the idea of, we all hear about going to a graveyard, on Halloween or something, and wouldn't it be frightening? You see all these ghosts running around. Well, there are just shells there, right? Those are just bodies. If you believe in the spirit, they should have moved on. However, in the traditional sense, and I think it's a Germanic practice originally, when they made a burial ground, they would slay one individual, figuring that the spirit of that one individual would become the guardian of the entire place. Woe betide the person who got the lucky draw, I suppose. However, even relatively modern times have seen suicides who have taken their own lives being buried on a northerly or a northwestern portion of a church, which is considered traditionally the area for the unsanctified to have been buried. Sad but true. I hope no one's going on a trip shortly. However, I'm going to be referring to a very classic case of an airship, a sort of dirigible called the R-101 that went down, and it was one of the classic cases of ghostly communication. It is an odd coincidence that there was a flight, Eastern flight, which was 401, which went down. Not only, and you probably may remember a movie made about this years ago with Ernest Borgnine playing the fellow I think was the navigator. There were bits and pieces of Flight 401 that were reincorporated into other planes, other craft. And those craft began to experience odd psychic phenomena, including seeing this fellow on board. Now, they thought this was great to see an old familiar face, except that this gentleman had checked out some time before. It was very disconcerting to them, but it is an interesting case in point that something traumatic happened to that aircraft, and the bits and pieces, the discarnate bits, incorporated into something else were enough to summon that mood, that episode experience again, which is what we're going to be looking at again and again here tonight. The possibility that things are impressed with a mood, an energy, an atmosphere. Just as down the road, if you visit Christ Church Cranbrook, you will see many wonderful examples of medieval stonework, which were literally incorporated into the modern, late 20s stonework and building to give you the look of a very traditional church. In St. Dunstan's Chapel in the Undercroft, you will see a stone which has been let from Glastonbury Abbey in Britain, where St. Dunstan, the historic St. Dunstan, had spent a good deal of time. Something old is infused into a new place. Could it possibly be tapped for the echoes, the things it's seen? Can you imagine if we could tap inanimate objects for what they've seen and heard? We'd probably want them to shut up at times. The Screaming Skull of Bettiscombe. There is a whole field of study of skulls, screaming and otherwise. The notion of the head being the repository for the brain or the spirit, for a while even Descartes had agreed that the soul was located in the pineal gland. The idea of the head being more than a trophy, pre-Celtic, the idea of head hunting, displaying your trophy, because this was the seat somehow of the person, of the wisdom, of the characteristics. So when skulls are found, they are an object of grisly fascination. This skull is said to have been the skull of a West Indian slave who was promised on his deathbed that they would bury him back home, and they never did. And the story is that when they attempted to bury his body, skull included, the skull began to scream. And that every time they would try to bury the skull or put it away, strange things would begin to happen. So they have literally come to terms with it. It is one way to get ahead of the situation. I had to say it. And they leave him out to look around. He's quieter this way, we're told. There are also other types of vessel. You've heard the classic tale of the Flying Dutchman. Some of these stories become almost archetypal because you'll hear many different stories of ghost ships, right here in the Great Lakes for that matter. But the idea that for some reason a vessel was cursed or was destroyed through some tragic circumstance, and it is almost as if it is replayed to witnesses. The cases of the Dutchman, or sloops, schooners, clippers, out of time, fill many books. There are many, many accounts, obviously strange things at sea. I'd point out to you one interesting thing, and that is we're discovering more and more at supposedly haunted sites there are often underground streams or springs. Could these act as conductors? Might it be one of the reasons that we find even the ancient megalithic stone arrangements, you know, Stonehenge, that kind of thing, that there are underwater springs there? Could they be a conductor for human energy? We know that many of the ancient megalithic stone sites were built on areas filled with what we call today electromagnetic energy, an EM field of force, if you will. We can measure it with what we call a Hell probe or a Gauss meter, but what did the ancients use? Because they knew that there was earth power, and they marked those sites using these stones. But we find also the coincidence of water. It is interesting, I think, that when you look at the anomalous situations at sea, talk about water being a conductor, who knows? It's just a theory. Phantom locomotives as well. I mean, I'd be hard-pressed to find a category of transportation that hasn't been considered ghostly. It'd be, you know, I could tell you the story of the horrible, ghostly double-decker red bus in London, but that wouldn't seem as horrific as a train traveling over a bridge in Scotland one night and having the train plummet when the bridge broke down in the middle. And then they rebuilt the bridge, and on the anniversary of that tragic circumstance, people will see a ghost train of another era traveling that modern stretch of what used to be old track. Or even yet, the stories of Lincoln's funeral cortege, that train being supposedly seen, complete with skeletal, ghostly, wraith-like engineer aboard. Now, in things literary, Marley was dead. That's how A Christmas Carol, or as I believe the story originally appeared, A Christmas Tree appeared in print. There was the story of old Scrooge, who had to be visited, literally, by a series of ghosts in order to get his act together. In this sense, the classification of ghost, he was lucky enough to be warned. All right? I would consider that it would be probably not a pleasant experience, but at least somebody was giving you the benefit of the doubt. History. Back to Dr. Johnson, a very famous episode called the Cock Lane Ghost in London. Dr. Johnson, it has been pointed out, was sort of an early version of Sherlock Holmes in many ways. You will say, well, I never heard that. I hope I can tell you many things you've never heard. However, one of the things Johnson had surmised, I think it was in his Rambler one of his Rambler discourses, his essays, he talked about how to determine a man's profession by the state of his clothing, making these deductions. Well, Johnson investigated this story of the ghost in London, which seemed to be a very early poltergeist, pesky spirit. He was of a mind at the end, probably, that the lady who was making these odd noises was passing them off as something supernatural. But Dr. Johnson was perhaps a very early version of Ghostbuster. Sometimes with some of the gentlemen and the people you're going to be seeing tonight, you'd be undecided as to whether they're Ghostbusters or boosters. In 1848, the Fox sisters in Hydesville, New York, sort of started a modern revolution of the idea of spiritualism, the idea of discarnate spirits coming through, rapping, communicating with them, you know, yeses and nos by so many raps, tables lifting, crockery flying. There are two sides to the story of the Fox sisters. One of them is that they were outright frauds. Too often in the annals of psychical research, you'll find an individual later saying it was all a hoax. And then later than that, they'll say, somebody paid me to say it was a hoax. It wasn't a hoax. Modern surmise is left sort of dangling, because face facts, when we're looking at exploring these kinds of unusual stories like poltergeists or monsters or UFOs, it's hard evidence we require. The difficult thing is, does the human witness, the percipient, does that person matter? You know, can our eyes be fooled? And there's also an interesting thing I should point out to you briefly, and that is too often today the people investigating these unusual things are tainted by their own foreknowledge of things and can affect an investigation. If I was brought into a situation where somebody's house was allegedly haunted and the crockery's flying around, I might very easily say to you, madam, how old is your daughter? And she says, I didn't tell you I had a daughter. And I said, but how old is she? Well, she's 9. But how did you know? Well, that's not being psychic or Sherlock Holmes. It is simply that through the annals of poltergeist, there is a predominant number of cases where young, pre-adolescent girl children are in the home. A number of explanations for this. But you see, what we try to do is to find something that has a repetition to it, that may allow us a predictability. And I think I can safely say to you, I'm only 42, and I've probably had only 20-odd years looking at this seriously, but the idea being that after all of my wizened studies and research, I can safely say to you that the most consistent thing about psychical research, psychical episodes, psychical phenomena is their inconsistency. Because just about the time you think you've got it figured and can measure it in a laboratory, everything comes apart. I also don't believe you can necessarily take people of psychical talent like mediums, sensitives. I hate calling them channels these days. Channel's a better verb than a descriptive noun. But it is the idea, it is very hard to take somebody who seems to have demonstrable talent, place them in a laboratory, and to say, all right, it is 12:02, do your stuff. Because if they are able to be sensitive enough to go out and reach with their mind, that's a talent, that's a gift, if you will. It is a psychic ability. And we're going to talk about the fact that we have, since the Fox sisters got a lot of interest in spiritualism, people dedicating themselves to studying these odd, weird effects. Not supernatural. Think about it. Can nature supersede itself? Can God out-God God? I'd prefer paranormal. All right? Paranormal, going beyond the normal. And what we try to do then is to see something that will repeat itself. Now, after the Fox contagion of sorts, hysteria swept not only the United States but throughout Europe, the idea of communicating with spirits took many different forms. The Ouija board was very popular. I will advise you, if it counts for anything, that I have learned of more occasions that have been brought on by the use of the Ouija board. And they're not funny, and they're not exciting. Maybe they are at first. But more people have literally invited problems to attend them. Some of you know exactly what I'm saying. I'm not going to try to sound like a fundamentalist and say Ouija boards are the thing of the devil, except to say that Ouija boards have been devised as sort of a telephone link to the beyond, if you will. All right? I don't know about you, but I believe in good and evil. My notion, however, is that evil was nothing more than negative psychological thought. That would be bad enough. If there is something else out there to boot, why would you simply invite it in? Would you share your toothbrush, even, ladies and gentlemen, be honest, with your husband or wife? Would you share your clothing with a stranger? So offering to say to something, come on down, through a Ouija board has quite often, it sounds lighthearted, but there are so many cases of people who suddenly can't get rid of the odd things going on in their houses, who literally have felt plagued, bedeviled, bothered. I had a lady talk to me from Ann Arbor a couple of weeks ago who was at her wit's end because she'd begun playing with the Ouija board in New England years ago. They've moved to Michigan. Whatever was going on had seemed to follow them. There are many people who will put the Ouija board as the reason for it. All right? That's just a bit of friendly advice, because I could be wrong, except there are more cases where literally all hell is broken loose, even if it was just psychological, because of the Ouija board. Now I want to say something specifically to, I hate saying younger, because everybody's younger than somebody, but especially those of you who are young enough to really get into this stuff and really be interested. That doesn't mean I'm not talking to somebody who's 83, but I'm talking about, I remember when I was 15, 16, 17, 18, etc., I was very attracted to studying these things. You've got to be able to know when to draw the line, the limit. All right? Because believe me, what you don't know can possibly hurt you a whole lot. The Ouija board may be a conductor of sorts, of all sorts of things. The spiritualist heyday also saw all sorts of things happening, tables rising, chairs leaping about, the idea that spirits were involved in these things, because obviously they would have to be, right? Some cases they might have been. More often than not, they were probably tricks. And yet people were in the mood to receive this kind of thing. I mean, wouldn't you all love to see a table or a chair levitated? Sure you would. Probably not in your living room. You know that scene, I'll give you two examples in films. Poltergeist, where she turns around and all the kitchen chairs are stacked up. Or with the Ghostbusters, the curious stack of books. This is not made up. This sort of thing has happened. Now, maybe there's an unknown cause for this, or maybe somebody just decided to get somebody else's goat. However, it's sort of like when you turn around and something is automatically different and you've been in the room the whole time, you have a tendency to wonder about it. There was much during this era, however, which suggested that these odd things were going on. People having the ability to move things, shift them about with mediumistic, spiritualistic talents. Does anybody here think they have the ability to levitate things? At least you're honest. Does anybody here think that they could, if the power of the mind was strong enough, do you think that you could lift a table? You know, remember what the man said, tell the mountain to move if your faith is strong enough? Young lady right there at the end. Can you step around here? Step up here on stage. Didn't expect this, did you? Come here. Come here. You can tell she's a believer just by looking at her. Do you believe in ghosts? All right.
Sleepovers.
Sleepovers. All right. Do you think that your mind is probably capable of making all sorts of things happen?
I guess.
Do you think if you put your mind to it, we could move this table?
I guess.
I don't know if we can do this. Our camera people may have to cut away for a moment as I do this, but quite often during the heyday of the seances, they would gather people together, and the collective energy would allow them to bring the spirits in, to hover about. Do you think the faith in this room would be strong enough to raise an article of furniture? Even a light little table like this. What I'm going to ask you to do is to join me. All right, we'll throw this down here. Now, what I want to do is I want you to put your hands on the edge of the table there. All right? Now, what I want you to do is concentrate, audience, on making this table move. Let's see how good you are. Just see if your right hand on it. All right? Put your fingers right up close to mine. All right, now I want you to concentrate on making this table move. You want to help her? You want to concentrate on making this table go up? Keep holding my fingers. She's pretty good. Did you ever know you could do this? You did. To have you over when I move next. Okay. That was excellent. Give her a big round of applause. She's very talented. Now, you would be amazed the amount of money that people could have made doing this kind of thing. And you have to admit, it is pretty frightening. Now, we don't want anybody going home with nightmares tonight, do we? The idea of a ring which is notched and catches the head of a small nail, you have to admit, the effect, all of you sophisticated, terribly jaded people, the effect is still interesting. Now, the effect 100 years ago made great psychic figures out of many. Not to take away from her talent, because I'm sure she could do this and she'll try it when she gets home. However, there were individuals such as Daniel Douglas Home, a Scotsman who it is said had psychic ability from his birth. It is said that ghostly hands rocked his cradle. He was gifted with many talents. He could do certain basic things like elongate his height, vary his weight. Well, I know many people, including yours truly, who can vary his weight. However, Home was capable of levitating. I would recommend him to you. This library may have a biography, or you could ask them to get it. It's a very fine book called Heyday of a Wizard by Gene Burton, which is about this man, Daniel Home, because in broad daylight, before hundreds of witnesses, he could sit on a piano and the piano would raise up from the air. Now, he didn't have a notch in his pants. They literally, on occasion, felt as if something from above was literally pulling him upwards. He claimed that he had cooperation with the spirits and was in contact with them. He never took money to do what he did. However, he performed before the crowned heads of Europe, and he took gifts quite often. And he was given the sad knowledge at one point by the spirits that they didn't like this and they were going to take his powers away from him for 1 year. And they did. And he couldn't function, couldn't serve as a psychic, as a medium, anything like this. Couldn't levitate worth a darn. But it is said that 1 year to the moment as midnight struck, the bed in which he lay, the headboard began banging and moving around, and the bed began waltzing around the room, and he knew that they're back. And they were. He is an interesting figure to study because he was never debunked. There are certain episodes, such as him moving out of a window horizontally, one window and then coming in through another. There are studies that have been made to take away from this, but a lion's share of the things that he did in performance could not be debunked. Not even Doug Henning necessarily could replicate it. Doug Henning, by the way, you may wonder why you haven't seen him recently. I was told that not all that long ago he was in India actually studying with some of the priests there on this notion of levitation. Maybe he got tired of having to truck the guy wires, you know, to all the theaters and all the other tricks. This man is perhaps, in a way, the granddaddy of many of the Ghostbusters shadow chasers. In literature, you may go back to, from the Victorian period on, and read about ghost hunters. Carnacki, the Ghost Finder, written by a man named Hodgson. Or Algernon Blackwood's John Silence. It was an era when the notion of hunting ghosts was sort of romantic. And it was the same formula as Ghostbusters, only Harry Price had the leisure to look at them all over the world, and he did. And to his credit, he set up the first national laboratory to study psychical research in Britain. And he tested mediums. He went all over the world looking at mysterious cases. He had, talking about a mysterious case, a case full of ghost-busting equipment, if you will. The standard paraphernalia, if you will. Cameras, lenses, batteries, bells, tripwires, cornstarch, flour. Things that seem to be designed more to catch a human malefactor than a ghost. Would a ghost worry about a tripwire? But you see, it was the skeptical standpoint that had to be maintained. The idea of, what if it's somebody trying to pull a trick? Now, Harry Price was, if he was a sort of a psychical sleuth, he had his Dr. Watson and his friend Professor Joad. Here are the two of them in a bedroom in a house which was supposedly haunted, and they waited all night for something unusual, something supernormal to happen in this house, and nothing happened until morning, when suddenly the light, you see the bulb above, the light began vibrating and then started to swing. And Price said something probably like, well, what the deuce is this? I knew sooner or later something would happen. And Joad said, well, calm down, old fellow. Listen a little more carefully. And they could hear an underground train going below the house. And every time this train would pass, it would turn out that it would vibrate and this light would swing from side to side. Well, Price was honest enough to tell that story on himself. He was asked to do a number of investigations. He looked at a variety of poltergeists, mediums, talking mongoose on one occasion, little people. He broadcast his results quite often over the radio and wrote about them in the newspapers, a formula that I don't mind at all, because after all, somebody's got to find out that somebody's crazy enough to make their living at this kind of thing. In this case, he was broadcasting from a haunted house, talking about what a real psychical investigation would entail. Here he is at the Hartz Mountains. This is not Birdseed being Hartz Mountains. This is the peak of Mount Brocken. And they're standing in a form of pentagram, he and Joad. They were going to conduct a ceremony, an ancient ceremony from what was called a grimoire, or a magical book, which would change a goat into a handsome young man. All they would need would be the proper ritual, the magical symbols, and they would need a young lady of, shall we say, unblemished virtue. Well, they performed this ceremony, and Price said, I have to tell all of you, remind you, we're doing this to illustrate what people used to believe. I don't necessarily think this is going to happen. He's probably hedging his bets, because when they did the hocus pocus, the goat stayed a goat. Now, Price didn't offer any excuses, except they did discover, I guess over the next couple days, that her virtue was not as unblemished as it was supposed to be. And Price said this probably accounted for why it didn't work. But he was always one to want to investigate. He, as well as somebody that he dueled with a little bit in the press, and that was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, who became an ardent crusader for spiritualism in his later career, devoting, in fact, a heady part of his own fortune to getting the word of this new revelation, a form of religion which combined every major religious truth. Spiritualism, he felt, was the way. It was, in fact, on Conan Doyle's passing, however, in 1930, that Harry Price utilized the services of medium Eileen Garrett, and he attempted to reach Conan Doyle in this spirit world where Conan Doyle insisted he'd be drinking gin and sodas and playing golf, and he said it'd be pretty much just like we'd expect life to be here. Well, at any rate, about the same time, the R-101, the airship, had gone down. It was known that, rather like very curious and bizarre parallels to our own shuttle disaster, it was forced into the air in a sort of time race. It was not ready to go up. Well, to make a long story short, when Price and the medium attempted to reach Conan Doyle, they eventually did reach something calling itself Conan Doyle, but intruding in the seance were the voices of the airmen from the R-101 airship. Now, it seems grisly, except that a series of messages that were so technical, so mechanical, offering privy knowledge that only people in this project could have known, especially from those people in charge. One man saying to another man still alive, you know, it was sort of like the left strut rudder or whatever it was, and we knew that shouldn't have worked out, and tell Simmons that it's wrong and next time not to do it, warning them. Everything that from personal messages. Tell Mary to look in the back of the closet behind the brown shoes. She'll find the money that I've put away there. Incredible things. And if you read this, there's a book called The Airman Who Would Not Die by John Fuller. It details as vital and vibrant a communication as you will ever expect to find. Interestingly, the authorities tried to hush the entire thing up because the R-101 disaster was an embarrassment. It didn't help confidence in the military. Sound familiar? However, it stands as this unexpected example of somebody coming through from the other side, but many somebodies. And I would repeat to you, the information was so technical and so, in some cases, secret, the mechanical detailed messages from the people who were on that airship, that it would be hard to imagine how the medium could have made it up or even researched it. Harry Price was called in by a newspaper editor to the case of a house in Borley outside of London in Essex. The place was called Borley Rectory. Price was given an account of things happening in this house that eventually made him think of it as almost a Mount Everest of haunted houses. I mean, take your pick. Ghosts, certainly. Noises, yes. Voices, laughter, shrieks, music, scraping, grating, apports and esports, objects appearing suddenly, objects disappearing, things being misplaced, people being in a room with the key on the inside of the door and hearing the key lock from the inside. Odd things. From the moment Price became involved looking at this, the entirety of the house seemed riddled with unusual episodes. His eventual way of tackling this was to bring in 48 investigators and allow them to be resident within the house and to keep track of the unusual things that happened. Now, Price is another episode. He's rather like the Shroud of Turin. Some people have thought they had him figured out, and even now his defenders say these are people who envied him too much. He was a showman. And I can't defend this prospect, that there have been many great mediums who have performed miraculous things who've also been caught cheating, working up their effects. You may not like it or understand it. Does that take away from their true talents? Well, from a perceptive point of view, it might. Harry Price was accused of hoaxing the effects at Borley Rectory. However, the tradition of Borley Rectory being haunted, including a phantom coach, as well as a nun who was seen walking with some regularity around the house. As a matter of fact, I'll go back to that cutaway drawing. There is a window which is on the right-hand lower portion. Actually, this slide is reversed, but it doesn't really make a lot of difference. The little dotted white line there points to the window where the nun could be seen walking, and they literally bricked it up because they couldn't stand the sight of seeing something that wasn't supposed to be there after a while. But you can imagine it was a disconcerting sight. There were, this phantom coach would sort of disappear at a point in the woods. Here's obviously a very trustworthy looking maidservant pointing to where it went. We don't know whether she was in the sherry or not, but so many people had seen these curious things. Now this certainly doesn't look like any place that would harbor a ghost, does it? Chill, dank, empty. Place almost seemed like an echo chamber at times. However, it seemed to contain something strange, something which when they began using mediums and even worked the Ouija board, some things that seemed not to be nice. There were messages that would appear on the walls. One of the tenants, his wife, he was a man of the cloth, and his wife Mary Ann saw this message written to Mary Ann, and she would ask it, she would write below it, "What do you want?" And then, it seemed like not long after that, something would write, "Get help," or say a mass. It was almost like a back and forth communication. They got to the point where things would continue to appear on walls, even when the investigators were the only ones in the house. They would circle the last thing that they had seen, so that anything that wasn't circled, they'd know would be new. This is the summer house where Reverend Bull, the first major tenant who'd called the case to public attention, newspaper attention anyway, used to watch the phenomena from his summer house. Doesn't sound like Disney World, does it? The effect of the spirit communications through the Ouija board had indicated that there was a nun who had been there at that site long ago, and that she had died tragically and was buried. Price had occasion to dig in the area where they were given to believe there would be a body, and they found a bit of a skull and a jawbone, which Price reinterred in holy ground. However, they still didn't know whether this was the phantom nun and why she continued to walk. It is an unusual place, Borley Rectory, and it was right up to the time when, following the news flash, if you will, that had come through a medium, one of these discarnate voices saying that the house would burn, that it would be destroyed forever. There was in fact a fire. Borley Rectory was consumed in flames from the building that you see here. There were very many accounts that people watching the rectory go probably weren't sad about it, but they claimed to have seen figures standing in the windows as the house burned, even when the flooring had fallen out. The last chapter to the Borley story is not necessarily the last one, because even though the house was razed down to the foundation, the church, which is adjacent to the rectory site, seems to have had a transference of the psychical energy, and particularly near the Waldegrave tomb in that church, throughout the entirety of the church, odd muted musical noises, figures dashing back and forth, fragments of voices. Now these things have been studied in an isolated atmosphere using the best sound recording, photographic instrumentation. It's the sound recording that's picked up a lot of this anomalous stuff through the church, stuff that they think they can discount as having been radio signals or somebody listening to television upstairs, those kinds of disturbance things. So Borley Rectory does go on. The thing that is curious is all the critics who said that Harry Price conjured it up as a great story for the newspapers forget two things. The phenomena was going on before Price had heard about it, and it continued after his death, and continues to this day. He is a very famous man within certain annals of psychical research, but it would be no surprise that most people have never heard of him. This man, however, is a little more famous. Joseph Banks Rhine had been researching the bastard science of parapsychology at Duke University, the idea of extrasensory perception, the idea of being able to predict playing card symbols, what they developed into what they called Zener cards, you know, the wavy lines, circles, stars. This is what Ann and I did before the program started, and we didn't have the cards, but we did something that was of interest. Rhine said, what interests me is not so much that somebody will be able to predict which card is turned over now. He said, what interests me is that somebody will be able to predict a card that is not going to be drawn until a year passes, as if they can reach into the future. He thought very much of what was attributed to being supernatural could be explained beyond the body, extrasensory, reflections of the human personality. That's to say, if we can communicate via thought, and if some people, as they claim to be able to, can move an object without touching it, psychokinesis, or affect objects such as poltergeist things, perhaps somebody with a great energy bank, sort of a disturbed energy bank, can make the plates fly off the rack on the wall. That doesn't mean it's a ghost. Maybe it's the ability to use that energy field in some way. He was fascinated by this. I met him in 1974, and we corresponded until his death. He had invited me down to the laboratories. He was a fascinating man. He also was a prototype, he and his wife, Louisa, for many of the husband-wife, Mr. and Mrs. North kinds of circumstances where people, you see couples investigating haunted houses. Rhine said it to me in one of his letters. He said, you know, the major thing that you have to be concerned about is a good researcher keeps an open mind, has to be skeptical, has to look for evidence. And he said, even though I'm rather on in years now and I can't be with you, he said, I'll be watching your progress from afar. And now that he's someplace else, I often think about that and hope that he likes what he sees. I do get the impression, however, he's probably got many of the answers he's been looking for. This was a man named Montague Summers, who was an expert in vampires, werewolves, ghosts. A man of dubious clerical training, he became a specialist in the occult, and you will find many of his writings on these subjects, some of the most literate and well-researched, however. So when you're looking for ghost lore, looking for things by Price, looking for things by Summers, collecting this antique data is very good. If you're looking for something about extrasensory perception, Rhine is your man, R-H-I-N-E. There were others in the field as well. Harry Houdini here with one of his mentors, the magician Keller. Harry Houdini was, I would say, dead set in proving the notion of survival. He has been studied many different ways and from many different perspectives. Did he really believe? Was he looking to believe that his sainted mother, his late mother, had passed on, that he could believe in her? He never really did. It is thought by many of the spiritualists that the cosmic powers were angry with Houdini, and that's why he died rather sadly and violently. Died here in Detroit, as you may know. It is also an interesting footnote, I think, that before he died in Detroit, I think it was 20 years prior to that, he had visited the city, had performed at a theater, I think it was the Alhambra. The police had given him handcuffs that were deliberately fixed that he couldn't get out of them. It took him over an hour and he got out. And so he accepted the challenge to make an escape from the Wayne County Jail. He went over to the jail, looked at it, and knew that he couldn't get out without outside help. So to save face, he decided to make a bridge jump. And so he said, have you got a good bridge here? And they say, well, we've got the MacArthur Bridge over there near Belle Isle. And so he made this famous jump, which you can read. You can read Houdini's version, or you can read how it really happened. However, both of them were fantastic escapes. Detroit was always a rough town, I think, for Harry Houdini. As we mentioned, Conan Doyle, who was called many things, and he leveled number charges. Rhine told me one of the things that pleased him the most was a headline saying, Rhine is a pompous ass, signed Conan Doyle. One of the things that Conan Doyle came in for a drubbing on was he believed in fairies. These little girls in Cottingley in England had claimed that the fairies would appear for them and that they could photograph them. And they would only appear for them, though. And they said, well, could you get us more pictures? And they said, yes, but just leave the camera with us. They won't come out for anybody else. Well, a number of people bought this because there's always been an esoteric belief in nature spirits, or what they call divas, or fairies, little people, brownies, gnomes, leprechauns, all right? But in this case, they found that the fairies appearing in the pictures were very much like fairies that had come off a soapbox and some other commercial advertisements. they seemed to have been hoaxed. Well, poor Conan Doyle said, well, that may have been the case, however, there still really are fairies. And this is the man who was the father of Sherlock Holmes, so maybe he got off, but not very well. Many people believe that his interest in the occult and spiritualism, it may have earned him a knighthood, but it cost him a peerage. Here he is with Harry Houdini, who rather like the fairy thing. Conan Doyle insisted that Harry Houdini had magical powers. And Harry said, well, you know, Arthur, really, they're just tricks. And Doyle said, ah, you think they're tricks. But, you know, you're really in touch with... And Houdini said, no, 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 no. Well, in 1978, we conducted the last seance as an experiment from the death room at Harper Grace Hospital where Harry Houdini had died, 52 years before then, at the age 52. Two mediums were there. One of them couldn't work at all, and the other one claimed to be in touch with an entity called Eric Weiss, which was Houdini's real name. And he admitted, if you believe that was Harry, that he was working on something that would allow him to bilocate. And there was a suggestion that his interest in the occult had made him more of a believer than he'd let on. However, at this point, he and Arthur are both long-distance calls, but at least they've got something to agree upon. Or disagree upon, who knows. Conan Doyle had reflected certain supernatural tendencies. One of his favorite stories, The Hound of the Baskervilles, reflects the idea of ghostly hounds. Especially they're a particular thing in the odd studies in Britain, the idea of hounds particularly turning into ghosts, maybe because they're a little more ferocious. Of course, the one in the story was coated with luminous paint, but Conan Doyle had heard of an antique tradition of these hounds being seen in the skies, and he had tailored this to make for the Hound of the Baskervilles story. Now, I have a particular interest in Conan Doyle because we're working on something that is rather like, I guess, Hal Holbrook's presentation of Mark Twain. 2 years ago in London, I met this wonderful lady who is Jean Conan Doyle, who is the last surviving daughter of Sir Arthur. Now, even more tonight than even at that point, but when the beard goes and the jowl comes back and I have what my mother calls a sensible haircut, there is a vague resemblance between somebody here and Conan Doyle at middle age, which this lady thought from the beginning. However, it's allowed me to spend time with her, the most recent being a few weeks back, in which we've been talking and researching how her father spoke, how he moved, how he smoked his pipe, and we're hoping to debut it. There is a chance that we may do one of the touring versions of An Evening with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle here at Bloomfield, so stay tuned. I give this not as a commercial to you, however, as much as the idea that I have become very privy to a lot of the things that Conan Doyle believed in, and he was very level-headed. He did try to judge things by evidence, but he did want so much to believe also. And there's an interesting clue here. His father, Charles Altamont Doyle, was put into an asylum, but he didn't seem to have been insane. He may have been an alcoholic, he may have been an epileptic, but if you want to see some wonderful drawings of fairies, you will look for collections of Charles Doyle's works, and they are the most incredible and beautiful illustrations of fairy lore. And it is odd that the one ringer early on that we had from Conan Doyle the son was that he seemed to believe in fairies. The same man who was writing about this great cerebral detective, Sherlock Holmes, who said, that, you know, this agency has no vacancy for ghosts. Holmes didn't believe in the supernatural, which many people believe is the major proof that Conan Doyle couldn't have written the stories, that Holmes was real. Makes sense, right? There were a number of wonderful photographs in the early ghost hunting days. Elliot O'Donnell, a very famous ghost hunter, loved this. The Phantom Monk of Bristol, appearing in this house, which at one time had been an ecclesiastical site. He had seen many photographs that had been hoaxed. He believed that this was legitimate. It could not be explained. There are many ecclesiastical type photos shot in churches. We're going to see some of them. However, this was taken at Raynham Hall in England. Allegedly, the traditional brown lady would come down the staircase. They had been shooting photographs for Country Life of Raynham Hall, and the photographer had seen something wispy up at the top of the staircase and train the camera on it. There are better versions of this, but like many wispy ghost photos, the more you look at them, the more detail you see. The fact of the matter was, though, that there was something there that shouldn't have been there. People have felt the presence of the brown lady. Many witnesses have seen her. Now you'll say, that doesn't look like anything to me. Well, it's like the Loch Ness Monster. If I show you a perfect picture, you say it's got to be a hoax. I show you a blurry shot of something that came out of the water, you say, well, that's not clear enough. There's no satisfying you people. However, there were examples in the mid-1870s. William Crookes, who was a famous scientist, held sittings, and supposedly the medium Florrie Cook had conjured up the wraith of Katie King, who was supposed to be an 18th century figure. Her father had been a pirate. Katie King had walked around, not only sat on Crookes' lap, she could be felt, she seemed to be real, she seemed to be human, and then she would disappear into the seance cabinet. It very likely was a great reason for scandal, because it seemed that poor Crookes was being gulled and was actually having an affair with the medium. However, it rocked much of the spiritual world and the technical world. People like Conan Doyle said, here's a man of science, a man we respect. Could he have been fooled? Well, the answer is yes, he could have been fooled. The Polish medium Franek Kluski could make things appear. On this occasion, out of a sealed room, he evoked something that appeared to be a cross between an eagle and an owl. They could hear it fluttering around. The picture you're seeing here was caught by a flash lamp. He also materialized something that looked like a large Neanderthal figure that went hulking around the room. Something from nothing. The old Donovan song, first there's a mountain, then there is no mountain, then there is. How do you explain the fact that there's nothing and then there's something? Well, in the cases of many of the early mediums, they could have been trapdoors, people very adept at fooling other people. Houdini used to be able to prove how mediums could ring a bell suspended under the table when everybody's feet were on everybody else's feet. He could slip out of his own shoe, and he had a half sock, and with his bare foot he'd reach under, ring the bell, and then slip his foot back in the shoe. The shoe was steel reinforced, so if you had your toe on Houdini's toe, you would feel something solid you'd presume to be a foot. Tricks. Now here's an interesting one for you. At the altar of a church, this elongated, it looks sort of like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar trying to fool us. He's awfully tall, this fellow. The only thing we can tell you is that these photos, and I'll point out when there's something that is thought to have been an avowed fake, because there were many double exposures and things, but to the best of their knowledge, and as the plates and everything had been studied, certain of these photos couldn't be explained away. This one couldn't be explained away. The longer you look at it, sort of the more frightening it becomes. It looks like one of the specters in Christmas Carol, to my mind anyway. Glamis Castle in Scotland had several ghostly and associated stories attached to it, that the Earls of Strathmore literally came of age by having to look at something very gruesome, very grisly, and learn a great secret. And there have been ghosts seen at Glamis Castle. The Queen Mother, Queen Elizabeth's mother, as a young girl, had lived there, and she had known of these traditions and supposedly had experienced a couple of them firsthand. There were many odd mediums rare, some of them not so hot. They conjured up spirits. They conjured them quite often through what they refer to as ectoplasm, a material which would be exuded by the medium through the mouth, through the solar plexus, through the navel. Show you a couple pictures. I hope they don't bother you, but you know, it's been a few hours since we've eaten probably, that are quite strange in terms of ectoplasm. Or there were the cases when the mediums would employ cleverly hidden or contrived images that could be manifest at the right moment to get the attention of the people in the sitting room. Some of the mediums became so adept they could swallow a cheesecloth image and regurgitate it at will, and regurgitate it in a way that the image would unravel itself, because obviously the medium was probably tied down, and then get it back in and regurgitate it. Sounds gross. There were many magicians showing how these things could be done. The Davenport brothers were very adept at this, as was a magician named Maskelyne, and of course Harry Houdini, who probably was the crusader to go up against mediums, and he said essentially that they were all phonies, which really brought him the ire of that spiritualist community. This is a picture taken with the flash lamp showing what's called a trumpet seance, a form of sound coming through a trumpet. Two trumpets, in fact. The medium has been tied down. This is one of these, the picture speaks for itself. What you see looking like twisted hankies there is representational of the ectoplasm, which is said to be coming out of the medium. There are ghosts and there are ghosts. If this picture had been manifest, oh, I don't know, around the turn of the century, the 1920s, I might have had a Daniel Douglas home-like practice. However, this is keeping matters closer to home. When the young lady posed and was photographed under all that tulle, my photographer friend, we wanted to come up with a good ghost-like picture. He was literally darkening some of the borders of the picture, and he said, "I've got one problem." And he called me the next day, and I said, "What's that?" He says, "Her feet weren't touching the ground." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Her feet didn't seem to be on the ground." And I said, "She's obviously taking her work very seriously." Here's another altar image. There is at least one very famous account of a ghostly priest who seemed to be performing the offices of the church, saying the Mass there, but looking imploringly at those people who would see him. Finally, somebody went over and celebrated the Mass with him, and it is said to have brought an end to the ghostly reappearance. Case in point here, looks almost to be, you may take that bit of white under the chin of this apparition to be a dog collar of a clergyman. I don't know. Hands seem to be folded. This is an example of the kind of photo that was taken, and when the film was developed, the empty church seemed to have had somebody in it. There were great lengths that they took to try to control and to contain mediums. Here, Harry Price had literally wired the medium up so as to be able to detect any type of movement, any type of fraud or hoax. It looks like he's knitting socks, but that's not really what it is. There were many spirit extra photographs. There was an entire industry for this, particularly when somebody who had lost a loved one was contacted by a spirit photographer who said, "We have your husband coming through. And then, you know, for $100, we'll sell you the picture of him from the other side." And of course, all they did was run double exposures of somebody's loved one with a photo of themselves. Mrs. Lincoln was shown a very interesting photo of Abraham Lincoln over her. Conan Doyle seemed to have come through any number of times. Although it's interesting, when I said to Jean Conan Doyle, "You know, it's said that your family stayed in touch with your father for a long time around the seance table," she said, "Yes, that's true. And it's said that the information was so personal that your mother had no doubt that this was her husband." She said, "Yes, this is true." And I said, "Well, why did you stop trying to communicate with him?" And she said, "Well, I'll tell you." She said, "You know how sometimes you'll telephone someone just to see that they got home?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "Well, once you know they're home, you really don't need to ring them back, do you?" They felt that he was home. Here's a case of a little bit of ectoplasm. It looks sort of like Betty Boop or Clara Bow making an appearance. It is said that spirits are imperfect, and that's why some of these images just aren't exact. This is the case of the appearance of Silver Bell, the medium Ethel Post Parrish at one of these spiritualist camps. The gradual ectoplasmic materialization of Silver Bell. This was not animation. This was pre-Roger Rabbit. It does have a tendency to look like a painted image. However, these pictures were shot bam, 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 and this is one of those they don't like, but they can't really explain. There have, however, been a rash of frauds. There's a man who wrote a book called Psychic Mafia, who was a leading figure at one of the spiritualist camps, who bilked a lot of people, and he talked about how he had done it. That doesn't mean, however, that there aren't legitimate mediums performing some incredible things. This notion of spirit guides coming across from the beyond, as Conan Doyle basically said, that he thought the entire thing was worth it for people to once more hear the sound of a vanished voice or feel the touch of a vanished hand. And if he could help them understand that, then he felt that his time was well spent. We have it brought into our entire society that the notion that ghosts exist is very possible. Last year, I investigated a case of a haunted bookstore in Detroit. I can't tell you very much about it because I don't want to, and I'm not trying to be cute, except that we got into this place with a psychic. She gravitated right to the area where the belongings that had belonged to a woman who had committed suicide and committed murder. We had a camera crew there, and we did a little post-Halloween feature. That night, the door adjacent to this area, it was very close to the roof, something had blown the door, the iron door, from inside out, ripped it off its iron hinges. It was very curious in that there was a layering of plastic to keep the draft from coming through. Something, whatever it was, had hit this door and literally ripped it outwards onto the roof, tearing the metal hinges off. The plastic was left intact except for about a 6 or 7 inch slash at the bottom. A lot of odd atmospheric things had been happening. They continued to happen with more frequency. Sounds of footsteps when there was nobody there. Everybody involved seemed to pay a price for this. I can't tell you why, except that everybody did. And it's very strange. I literally stopped the press from covering this last Halloween because I said it's never as easy as you people think it is. Nor is it meant to be entertaining, because after Halloween this will go on, and it's abated somewhat, but it is still going on to a degree. There's a shot taken on a staircase supposedly where something ghostly had manifested. In this case, looks like we got the Michelin Man. J.P. McCarthy said, "Now, Mark, it looks like somebody took a drag on a cigarette and photographed a puff of smoke." And I said, "That's true, Joe, except it's awfully hard, no matter how you practice, to get a head, what looks to be little eyes, arms, and legs." Now, you may not see that at all, but the moment we saw these pictures, we knew that there was something odd going on. This man, Konstantin Rodiv, believed that there were voices that you could pick up through common tape recorders, voices of the dead coming through. Went to elaborate lengths to prove that. Other research has been done. It's just hard in this day and age to rule out phantom voices coming across your telephone, your radio, or even your tape recorder with clean tapes. Rodiv said it's the dead trying to come through. A number of people are trying to research this idea today. You may think this is crazy. However, it goes back to Thomas Edison. Somewhere, probably in Dearborn, as we speak, below a mountainous pile, there may be blueprints for Edison's machine to talk to the dead. He was working on this when he died. People have seen the prints, the plans for it. We don't know if it worked. Edison hasn't called lately, I don't think. Automatic writing, the idea of the pen being guided by spirits, rather like Rosemary Brown, who was guided by the decomposing composers of the past. You've heard of people like this who supposedly write the novels of Dickens and play the sonatas of Chopin, whatever. They're never really quite exactly like what we remember, but they're reminiscent. The fact, it's like Samuel Johnson. You remember he said something about a woman preaching is like a dog standing on its hind legs. It's not so much that it's remarkable as that it's possible at all. The idea is that even if they're getting reams and reams through this, people in some cases, rather like Edgar Cayce, who weren't terribly well educated but were supposedly getting spiritual messages of import, of sophistication, that were very eclectic, things that they shouldn't know. Where were they coming from? We're all caught up in the Phantom of the Opera. This year, if you go to London, you can visit the Drury Lane Theatre, where actors and audiences alike, management have claimed to have seen the specter of an 18th century figure. No, this is not a real ghost picture. This is a simulation, but it represents what people have seen. Many, many people have seen. They also were doing some renovation in the theater many years back, and they found a wall which apparently had been a room at one point, and they did find the bones of a fellow who had been murdered, been stabbed to death. Some people thought maybe this was either an actor who gave a bad performance or maybe a critic who gave a bad review. And this could account for the Drury Lane ghost. Times of great stress, people see things when they want to see them. This was a picture shot in which people claim to have seen the face of Jesus in the clouds. This has happened more than once. There have been apparitional things seen, rather like people continue to see a variety of UFOs in the sky. Of perhaps more interest are the great numbers of appearances of the Virgin Mary. They've been put into a whole classification they call BVMs. That's not to be disrespectful. It is an abbreviation for the Blessed Virgin Mary as she has appeared. You know of Fatima, Lourdes, a number of other places, Garabandal. Well, in the late 60s, for almost 3 years, at a church venerated to Mary, at a place where supposedly Mary and Joseph had passed in Egypt, at Zaytun, they saw the Virgin, at least what appeared to be the Virgin, on the roof of the church. She would levitate, she would move about, she would bow. Her appearance was sometimes heralded by what appeared to be stars and doves. She was seen with such frequency, they knocked the building down across the street and put chairs in the square, and thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people would come and see. Believers, non-believers, critics, church people, investigators. The wonder of it is that they were able to photograph anything. Now the idea is, what does science say? They said it was the psychic pool thesis, and all these people gathered to see Mary, and so they did. It's an interesting thought that a projection of that kind of mind, of mass, could have been caught on film. Science says it was. They can't explain how it's done. There was a man named Ted Sirios, a bellboy, who used to have to get roaring drunk, and then he could supposedly impose images on clean Polaroid film. Other people have been able to do this as well. That may have been fantastic. The curious thing about Sirios is they'd ask him, they'd show him a picture of a place, and then he'd concentrate, and they'd take the picture away, and he'd zap his image onto the film, and on a couple of occasions, he'd give them a picture of the place, but as it looked 100 years ago. Possibly it's been suggested that UFOs are ghosts of the future. Perhaps there are these time warps, black holes, dwarf stars, all of these things we hear about today. The idea that perhaps the Loch Ness Monster is a dinosaur out of the past to slip through the warp. Maybe UFOs are coming from another time. Maybe UFOs have us inside of them. Maybe that's us at a sophisticated period in our history coming back in time to visit our ancestors. Crazy theory? Well, everything I'm talking to you about sounds crazy because it doesn't sound logical. It doesn't seem that we can codify any of this very neatly. People like Conan Doyle tried. They tried very, very hard, because they felt that there was something spiritual behind all of this if only we had the key. The problem is we seem to want, and it's good that we can find enjoyment and pleasure at such things like this, but there are no ecto-containment chambers. We cannot bust a ghost. If they tell you you can, you can't. There have been cases of exorcism, and believe me, they are very, very serious. You know, the Reverend Joe around the corner doesn't come in and just perform an exorcism. On occasion, I know of many where the minister's gone in and literally stirred things up. If the person has a legitimate problem or believes they do, it may or may not have an effect. If it is something demonic, well, remember The Exorcist? Somebody said to me long ago, well, you know, I saw the Ghostbusters and I was thinking about this, and just the other night I read this book about the Amityville Horror. And just tell me so I can get to sleep. Was the Amityville Horror for real? And I said, well, I have to tell you, if it's any of assurance at all, that basically the beginning of the whole Amityville thing was a hoax. It was designed to make money. There are people in litigation as we speak about all the money that's been made because they conjured this thing up. They said, oh boy, am I relieved. And I said, but I have to tell you that you remember The Exorcist? And they said, yeah. I said, that was based on a real case in which things even more severe had gone on to the little German girl whom they portrayed as a little American girl in the movie. Priests warring for her immortal soul. In the case of the little German girl, they knew they were going to lose her body. These priests were fighting for her soul. And there were the stigmatas, there was the spewing, there were the levitations, they had to strap her down. She was speaking in a variety of voices, choruses of voices, telling the priest's own inner fears and anxieties. It's a strange world. Now, many of you perhaps are here tonight to hear about Henry Booth, and I know I've kept you all much longer than you need to be kept. Some of you probably need to be kept. However, 2 years ago, I followed up with my friend Harry Booth. He had written a book in 1963 called Cranbrook Boasts a Ghost. It is in this library. It is about how, when they built Christ Church Cranbrook, a sort of ungodly workman disappeared, and they felt that he had fallen into the foundations of the church. Well, the story is about that workman. It's about St. Dunstan, the patron saint of craftsmen. It is about odd goings on there. And I said to Harry, I read this book when I was in junior high school. Now that you know I'm making my living looking at some unusual things, wouldn't it be funny to go over there and take a look for ourselves? And he said, well, I guess it probably would. And I said, do you have any worry about what they're going to say about Henry Scripps Booth, philanthropist, well-known man, illustrious family, ghost hunting at 90? He said, well, I suppose at this point it doesn't really matter what they think, does it? I wrote a story called Haunted Cranbrook, and it was out in Detroit Monthly Magazine last November, and they could find it for you here, I guess, if you were interested. But what we attempted to do was a postscript to this. Harry Booth was not well when we went and did this. We prowled through the old chapel. He showed me where the ghost supposedly had been seen. We took some infrared photography, which interestingly later showed a doubled up warp of light that some of the photographics people couldn't explain or understand, but it was at the very spot where they felt, since the ghost had been seen at this point, that maybe the workman had come to his restless peace. Harry said to me, well, you know, we really get on with this. We ought to get on with this, because if we don't, you'll be looking for me very shortly. We can laugh about that now and celebrate Henry Booth, because he was a wonderful man, and he had written a wonderful little book, which I would advise you, I would entreat you, if you want to read something wonderful about this area, or just an interesting little ghost story, look for it, ask for it. If enough people ask for it, they might even reprint it at Cranbrook. However, my adventure with Harry was for me to research and find that Cranbrook had been imbued with so much of the past, the long ago past, pre-Middle Ages past. Even the man's doorway to his home, Thornley, right across from Cranbrook grounds, he had a fragment of ancient Carthage set into the walk. So you'd have to cross Carthage to get into his house. Now I thought, this is interesting, because it was like many other places I'd seen where, almost as if echoes from the past or odd influences came from places being imbued with storied fragments of places. I used an Irish medium and ran her over the grounds of Cranbrook. She had no idea what it was about. She told me some wonderful and exciting things that we already knew, but she shouldn't have known. That's sort of in the story. But the idea was that when Harry knew about that little warp bit of light, he wasn't surprised. He enjoyed it, because he knew it was a sort of postscript. You will find that the book is said to have been written by Thistle, which was his pen name, people who liked him and loved him. And I'm only telling you this because if you want to do a little psychical investigation, check this book out. Or take a walk around Christ Church Cranbrook, or maybe go down to St. Dunstan's Chapel, and I guarantee you will be somewhat changed, not because it's haunted, not because there might have been a ghost, but because it's such a wonderful spiritual place, and there is that stone, which I found interesting. I had just come back from Glastonbury researching some Arthurian excavations, and at Glastonbury is where Arthur's supposedly buried. I had come back, Harry had had his 90th birthday, and we got talking about this, and next thing I know, I'm researching this church and St. Dunstan's Chapel. Serendipity said that St. Dunstan had spent time, the real St. Dunstan, at Glastonbury. Next thing I know, I'm looking at a piece of stone from the very abbey I'd been researching when I was in Britain. Odd connections. Wrote this postscript to this little story. We were waiting for it to be published, and I was anticipating, I don't know if there's anybody in the Booth family here tonight, but we wondered if somebody would say, how dare you have written about our father, our uncle, our whatever. Although Harry's manager had known about it, and you know, we had taped interviews talking about doing the project. And I had said to Henry Booth the night we set out, I said, you know, you're a little older than I am. I said, but whichever one of us goes first, why don't we try to give the other a sign? I used to get used to talking to Harry, and then I'd wait. And sort of like a train on the tracks, his reply would come. And he said, well, all right, we might do that. Well, I was given some reason to think that somebody in the Booth family might have been alarmed about the article, but I thought I knew Harry would have loved it. And the day after he died, I'm staring at a pile of obituary clippings about him, and I felt somebody come in and tap me on the shoulder, and I turned around in my office, and there was nobody there except there was Harry's picture. And I thought, gee, I wonder if that was his first shot at getting hold of me. It turned out that I wondered how I was going to bail myself out with the Booth family, and I looked at Harry's picture and I said, what am I going to do? What am I going to use if somebody says, you had no right to write this about our father? What's going to bail me out? Well, it turned out the following week I was looking at a house on Gros Isle I'd been asked to see because Custer, another one of my loves, Custer had visited this house on Gros Isle. And she said, we also found some things in the rafters. Well, it turned out she had a house which was owned by a man who was Harry Booth's uncle at one point, and there were these family papers. And she said, you might want to get these back to the appropriate people. And I thought, well, thanks, Harry, that's the bailout. Two, it couldn't have been more unconnected, but there was some line of thought running there. And the other thing is that there was a young lady after his death who had interviewed him and found him very metaphysical, and she claimed he was coming to her in dreams. A lot of people said she's crazy. I didn't, because as is natural when you lose somebody, I was having dreams about Harry Booth, talking to him, whatever. And I have to be honest with you, I had the last one a little over a week ago. And he seems to be doing very well, if that's any sign. However, the point of it is, if somebody loved a place, might they not, at least some echo of them, come back? And if you were allowed to come back, wouldn't you come back to some place you loved? And I used to kid with him. I said, you know, when you were more of a walker, at 3 o'clock in the morning, he used to tell me you'd get up and walk through your front yard, which was Cranbrook. And I said, one of these days, you're going to make a hell of a ghost. And he said, yeah, I probably will. I said it in the article, and I want to make one thing clear. We haven't seen Harry Booth's ghost, nor do I expect anybody will see anything. But I said that if there was any spirit inhabiting Cranbrook, Harry Booth's would be the best beloved spirit there of all. He was interested in looking at these things. It was a grand adventure. I put this episode in tonight because I'm trying to generate more interest for this book. I believe the rights to it are owned by Cranbrook now. Believe me, they've got a few dollars in order to see that this project could be furthered. But Harry was interested in so many things apart from this book. He was interested in religion and philosophy, all religions, all philosophies. And we talk about some of the things that would perplex. I showed him this photo. He got a kick out of it. I never had a chance to show him these. These were taken outside of Turin in Italy, where they keep the shroud, at a castle called Castello della Rota. These are images that were seen and photographed. Predictably, this place seems to have specters. There were Knights Templar at this place, too. They thought that in this one particular picture, whatever they shot had a Templar cross, although, stranger, it looks more like an Egyptian Ankh. We can't explain them. These are taken under test conditions. We don't know what they are. But we know there's something there where something's not supposed to be. That's what we've been talking about tonight. Now, there's not enough time, even though we've taken far too much. This is the season we celebrate spirits and ghosts and things. You know, in Mexico, the Dia de los Muertos, they'll go out and they'll deck the tombs and the graves, and they'll celebrate ancestors who have passed on. And the point is not to be afraid of them. Not to be afraid of the notion that a spirit might come back to a place it had known, right? I was talking to a group of senior citizens at a residence complex in Southfield weeks ago, and somebody said, how come you come out here to talk to us? And I said, well, truth to tell, I figure, one of these days I might be sitting out there with you, and I hope somebody comes out and tries to offer a program. Well, one of these days we may be spring-made sheet wearers, who knows? I think it's important, if we have any clue from all of our philosophies about reaping and sowing, is you might try to program yourself, if it's going to count later, for an interesting life. All right? Do it now, and maybe you'll find it magnified later. If what you do now is good, then that's fine. Many of the philosophies say when you reach spirit land, you just get to continue that. There may not be a hell. Hell may be not being able to continue it. But there's so much thought between the notion of mind and body and whether the two ever really separate at all. There will be things that I will wish I would have said to you tonight, except that I have spent a good deal of time looking at this, and I am basically more reassured than I am repelled. I would also close with the remarks of another ghost hunter years back who said, don't worry about ghosts. After all, they were only human. Right? So on that basis, it's a club that many of us will doubtless be joining. It's maybe important to understand what the membership and the dues are like. However, on that note, at this point, what I'd like to do is bring up the lights and ask if you have questions. Yes, sir.
On the photograph that you took, did you use standard film or any kind of special filters, like infrared?
Infrared, we find, is very good for shooting these supposedly haunted psychical atmospheres because it draws out the light. Quite often, infrared has shown us things that were not visible to the naked eye. And I want to follow up because we heard I heard something tonight that's fascinating. Jeanette was telling me that when, was it your father or grandfather?
My grandfather-in-law.
All right, grandfather-in-law, when the gentleman passed over, they had photographs of him. After his death, the photographs seemed to change. There were sort of double images. An image of another man seemed to be forming on the image on the photograph. It's as if the image was blossoming, if you will. It was altering. Psychic extras is an entire other field of interest. Taking photographs and finding something else appearing on them. There's been a lot of experimental photography done this way. Yes, ma'am?
In some of the pictures, I noticed that the things that were like ghosts, they didn't have a happy expression on them.
The ghosts didn't have happy expressions on the photographs. Well, you know, there's a school of thought that says if the spirit's going to move on, it moves on, but there may be a reason, maybe for some of them not. Maybe being disoriented, now these are big maybes. Maybe they have no reason to feel happy. Maybe it's not a situation like Topper, where everybody's having fun. They are maybe confused. Quite often, the notion, as in the earlier funereal practices with masses and prayers and ceremonies and Egyptian rituals of the dead, Tibetan rituals of the dead, was to help them to move on. Even the Slavic countries, they used to bore holes in the coffin near the head of the corpse so they could hear the prayers and better move on. Now this sounds crazy perhaps in a way, but it is the idea that when you die you don't necessarily move to wherever you're going. Perhaps help counts. If it doesn't, why do we pray? Those of us who do. It is the belief of collective will. Science currently says, many scientists will say that collective will imposes an image that we expect to see and we see. Jung said a similar thing about flying saucers. He said it was a traditional circular shape and we expect to see flying things because we read about them and so we do. But he also couldn't explain, and obviously a lot of room in his philosophy for this unseen world. So they may not be happy. I mean, I can show you a lot of photographs I've seen recently and these people weren't smiling either and they were alive. Some of you don't look too happy, which worries me. Yes?
When you were recently in England, did you see the wheat fields?
No, but I'm fascinated by the imprints of in the fields. Some of them looking very geometric. You could imagine a mothership sat down. There are, however, certain whirlwind natural effects that can cause some of these, and nature has been known to be very perfectly geometric. So it's a cross. But it is a mystery that bears a lot of explanation right now. Yes, sir?
Besides levitating things, can you ask auras and other things?
Can I see auras? If I told you what I saw around you right now, it's amazing. You know what I see? You know what I see behind you right now? A lady with a red blazer. We were kidding in a sense, you see, about the notion about being psychic. In the heyday of so much of the mediumistic stuff, there were a lot of tricks, a tremendous number of tricks. And I simply astounded Ann and Karen, who's in charge. You gotta astound the people that really in charge. That always helps. Because I said, pick a number between 8 and 80. Let it be a 2-digit number, all right? And I had a pencil and a piece of paper, a blank piece of paper. And I said, concentrate on it, and I wrote the number. All right? Then I gave her the pencil back, and I said, what was the number that you said? And she said, 89 or whatever the number might have been. And I said, well, it doesn't work all the time. And I handed her the paper, and it was the number that she said. Now, she was flummoxed, and I'm going to lose all of her respect by telling you how I did that. Except it's like the table trick. I just now lost it, except I would have shown it to you. It's a piece of carbon or lead, pencil lead, super glued under my thumbnail. And when I simply said to her, all right, give me a number, and I wrote it down with my right hand, I am left-handed, I wrote nothing. And then I handed her the pencil. Obviously, I couldn't be writing. And when I said, and what was your number? It's called the thumbnail gizmo. And I simply, with my thumbnail on that piece of paper, did the number. And then I handed it to her. It's a great effect. Some of you will be dazzling people. The hardest thing about the trick is keeping this darn piece of lead super glued to your thumbnail. There's some nights I've walked around for days with this horrible thing. It's what we sacrifice for art. Yes, ma'am. As a McPherson, I would tell you that Scottish people claim to be much more psychic than other people, but there's something in the Celtic strain that may possibly be that. But when I say Celtic, I can tell you the early Celts came from the area in Eastern Europe like Yugoslavia. So my Czechoslovakian grandmother on one side of the family was a Celt, just as my father's grandmother was. So I can tell you that I think there are certain strains that claim to be more psychic. All of you are psychic to one degree or another. It's a matter of waking it up, enhancing that power. Can you be trained to be more psychic? Yeah. Yeah. Much of what people like Kreskin convince us is supernormal we could all do to some degree. But you see, deception has a lot to do with things too. Yes, sir, you right there.
Can you read minds?
Can I read minds? I could up till about, a minute ago. Yes, sir.
On this recent experience at the bookstore you were talking about, you said there was a medium yourself, photographers also. Do you believe that this door just blew off, or could someone have done something before it all arrived? What do you think?
Well, the building was locked up, and I know the thing disturbed a lot of people, including the owner. Plus, the burglar alarms have gone crazy there. And like I say, it's been an experience shared by a lot of people.
Was it totally, you looked at it and said,
didn't like the look of it. It seemed to be. And then everybody involved in the thing, it was interesting. The people in the camera crew, the guy lost his job. People started getting sick. It was a very odd thing. I didn't like the way some remarks were being made about the person whose grave we were literally walking on. I started to want to pull back right away because I do believe in respect for the dead. I hope that comes across if I haven't said it yet tonight. Part of the danger of this kind of psychical investigation is like archaeology being desecration to a degree. Where maybe an archaeologist is prepared to say, hey, I realize that, but it's all for science. I say, phooey.
Are there times when you've actually been scared?
Have I ever been burned? Yeah, I have. And I'm smart enough to stay away from a lot of it. I will also be smart enough to refer on to somebody else when it sounds like it's a case either for a social worker, a psychologist, or an exorcist. Playing brave or playing funny, playing humorous. It'd be great if we could look at psychical investigation, as the Ghostbusters do. But you don't. You can't, because it's not that funny. When people call me, and the aspect of my consultancy is helping people understand whether they've got a problem or not, helping them get out of it may be something else. If I told you some of them, it would turn your stomachs. It would frighten you. It would keep you awake at night. There are some of you here tonight who've got things going on because I've talked to you, and you wish you could get rid of them. You think you know maybe why, but you know something's going on, right? Can you stop it? You may have to come to terms with it. Much of it may be right here. Much of it may be latent in ourselves as human beings. But if we believe in something beyond ourselves, that may factor in as well. I'm going to take one more question like George Bush this morning. He took 6. Yes, ma'am.
Is there some way we can know if we're going to be presenting something that there are all these different things that are over every one of us?
Sure. What I will do, I will take the liberty of asking Karen and Ann if I can, I don't know, whenever that's happening, if you keep your eye pinned to the bulletin board or whatever is here, or make a special crusade of Ann in the blue back there, look for her and say, when's that crazy guy going to be doing something again? Also, if you would like to write your name or address, I can put you on a mailing list, which might be an awful lot easier. I want to close on this note. We're talking about a big if. Is there something else than this, right? Plato talked about a perfect reflection of all the things that we regard as tangible. You know, somewhere up there in heaven there's a perfect lectern, there's a perfect book, there's a perfect me, right? That was philosophy. I think, personally, if you asked, I think there's got to be more. I think if I tried to collect everything and all the people I've talked to, there's something going on. And I think there's something that can be reconciled by our philosophies. And I would refer you, if you are looking for a wonderful ghost story to read, look for M.R. James. Henry James wrote Turn of the Screw, but M.R. James was an Anglican clergyman who wrote wonderful ghost stories to be read at Christmas time, which is when they really enjoy them over there. And he said, what is all this love for if we have to merely go out into the dark? And I believe that. I think what we see and feel between ourselves and love is a binding kind of factor. I think there's got to be more, don't you? Thank you for having me. I appreciate your coming. I will put the library people on the line, and I hope not on the defensive, by saying this. I've been working with a number of libraries here and even in England, a variety of programs. This time of the year, everybody wants to hear about weird stuff, all right? I am much more interested, say, in talking to you about all of the romance and the legends and the real archaeological side of King Arthur, for instance, all right? That kind of a program. And if you would like that kind of a program here, let them know somehow. Because to import crazy people like me, they've got to have a reason for having budgets and things like that. We all know those are... Imagine making your living this way. I had a man say to somebody I knew, he was listening to me give some presentation, he said, what does he do? She said, he does this. He said, no, what does he really do? She said, he does this. And he thought for a moment and he said, like Batman, Bruce Wayne, wealthy young man about town. And I said, I love it. It doesn't help when I look at the American Express bills, but I love it. Thank you for coming tonight. Appreciate it.